Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Ask Shane Anything. You're probably wondering, hey, why is this going up before Friday? Well, as you probably know, we're having issues right now getting an episode of Game Face out because Matt is ill, and he's not feeling better still. And so I can't sit and do nothing for a day because it's like a domino. So if I don't do something on this day, that means I'm going to be screwed on another day. That's how my schedule is. So we didn't do Game Face yesterday, we didn't do it today, and we may not do it tomorrow. So the thing is like, I need to do this today. So if we have to do Game Face tomorrow, it won't mess up Ask Shane for Friday. Anyway, it's tough when Matt's ill, trying to juggle everything and figure out how to get the content scheduled so you guys have something coming through the pipeline every day. And so that's why we're here today. The good news is you guys have loaded up the forum thread with tons of awesome questions. And in fact, there's 4 questions in today's episode instead of 3. However, that does mean I'm going to keep my answers a little bit shorter. This show can be an editing nightmare if I ramble on, so I need to keep an eye on it because there are more questions in this episode. Again, this show happens because some of you guys are pledging at patreon.com/sifted at that Ask Shane tier at $7 or more per month. If some of you guys weren't doing that, this show simply would not happen. Now, everybody gets to ask questions. Everyone gets to watch the archive. However, I do give precedent to those of you who are pledging at that higher tier. So, if you are pledging at the Ask Shane tier, you have a higher chance of getting your question answered. And with that, let's get on with this week's episode. All right, our first question this week comes from Derek D111. When will third-party publishers abandon the PS4 and Xbox One? I may not be remembering correctly, but when the PS4 launched, PS3 games were not produced 2 years after that. Is the big drop in the economy to blame, or maybe the law of diminishing returns where the PS5 isn't that big of a leap forward? Could Grand Theft Auto 6 be the catalyst? Okay, Derek D111, I guess the first thing that I would say is you're right. The transition from PS3 to PS4 was way shorter than the transition from PS4 to PS5. But I think that more has to do with the fact that the PS3 was a failure for PlayStation. Now, again, I realize it came on late. PlayStation fans will say it ultimately beat the Xbox 360. We know that's not true. We know that Xbox had basically given up on that generation by the time PlayStation started catching up at the end. So, but the truth is, not only that, the PS3 was really hard to program for, and a lot of third-party publishers and developers were happy to leave it behind. PS4, entirely different story, which I would argue is why the PS4 did so well. And so, you're right, the transition from PS3 to PS4 and then PS4 to PS5, huge difference. Now, you're asking if the dip in the economy is a thing. Yeah, it's not just a dip in the economy. We had a global pandemic that lasted for like 2 years, and these consoles launched right in the middle of the pandemic. Now, some may say that was a smart idea, because if you remember, during the pandemic, console sales, software sales absolutely boomed. And that's why we're now having this discussion about the bad economic environment now. And that's because you're trying to compare sales now to sales when everybody was trapped inside for 2 years. That's an apples and oranges comparison. It's not fair. So the economy dipped. I mean, is it really that it's dipped, or do we just have 2 years of anomaly where everything sold really well because people couldn't do anything other than play video games or watch TV? So, the whole dip thing, I'm not buying it. The fact that the industry actually hasn't really gone down that much from those 2 years is kind of impressive if you ask me. I feel like the publishers are using this as cover to make their organizations more lean for layoffs and to do some things that they wanted to do, but they couldn't when the industry was booming. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on with that right now. But back to your question about the transition from PS4 to PlayStation 5. I'll be honest with you, Derek, it's kind of over already. Like, when we see new games announced now, hardly any of them have PS4 or Xbox One versions anymore. And a lot of times now, we're seeing games that have been in development for a long time drop the Xbox One version right before they come out. So I think we're there. I think we finally got to the point where we've left last generation in the dust. Now, you mentioned it, like, there are certain franchises that are going to continue to be released for everything. Just Dance is one of those. Sports games generally will continue to be released for the old generation longer than other games. But I think mostly we've kind of already reached the point where we've left the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One behind. So Will GTA 6 help? Absolutely. And I hate to say it, but you're probably right. I think there is probably a significant contingent of players who are waiting for Grand Theft Auto 6 to buy a piece of next-gen hardware. I fully believe that. Now, PlayStation 5 still has another 100 million consoles to sell. I mentioned this on the last episode of Ask Shane Anything. There is a long way to go before this is over. So, you're saying, oh, it took a long time. It kind of did to transition to PS5, but look, we still have like another 5 years ahead of us of all PS5. So I understand why your perception is the way it is. I don't think it's as bad as you think it is, and I do think at this point, pretty much the industry has moved on to PS5 and Xbox Series. Okay, our next question comes from Khalib Twalai. In GameFace 383, you said that Game Pass was hurting the industry. It's the first time I've heard someone say that. How do you square that against the prevailing opinion that Game Pass is the future? Well, when I said Game Pass was hurting the industry, I was saying Game Pass is hurting the industry overall. I wasn't saying that it was hurting Microsoft. Although some may argue that that is absolutely the case. What I was getting at is that it's hurting the industry overall because no one is buying Xbox versions of games anymore. So, you're a third-party publisher, you're used to having at least 2 platforms to sell each game on. And each one, generally PlayStation will probably sell more than Xbox, but still, you are making a huge chunk of sales from Xbox. Since Game Pass launched, that is all ended. Nobody is buying games for Xbox anymore. They're only buying it for one platform. And that's another big reason why, to rewind to the last question about the economy, that's another big reason why you're seeing all these developers and publishers lay people off, because they've basically lost half of their addressable market, or 40% maybe, with losing Xbox. It is no longer a viable platform to sell games on. That's a big deal, man. If you're talking to like Ubisoft or EA, and EA is like, well, wow, we just lost 40% of our sales for Madden every year. And Ubisoft's like, we just lost 40% of our sales for Assassin's Creed every year. So that's what I'm talking about it hurting the industry. It's not really hurting Microsoft. It's not really hurting Game Pass because people are going to Game Pass and not buying games as much as they used to. So when I mentioned that on GameFace, that's what I was getting at. Now to your question, how do you square that against the opinion that Game Pass is the future? Well, I mean, is it the prevailing opinion? I know that's Michael Pachter's opinion, but is it the prevailing opinion? Do most people feel that way? I feel like that's starting to change. I mean, I've seen it with myself. As Game Pass has matured, it hasn't grown as much as I had anticipated, so I'm starting to hedge my bets a little bit about Game Pass. Pachter isn't. Pachter is continuing to double down and triple down on Game Pass, thinking it is the future, and I totally respect his opinion. He's been doing this a long time. So I think it comes down to opinion. Like, what do you think is going to happen? I don't think anybody knows for sure what the future is going to hold, but I do feel like Game Pass right now is kind of teetering right on the brink. Next up, we have a question from El Timbo. I have an old friend who plays through games as fast as possible, not speedrunning, but he doesn't explore at all and just goes from point A to point B like he's working a job. When I ask him why he does this, he always has some excuse, but he's been doing this since we were teenagers. I don't understand why he does this or why he even bothers to play games at all if he's just going to race to the finish. I'm guessing you know others like this. Why do you think they do it? Well, El Timbo, the first thing I'm going to say is as somebody who works in the games industry and relies on people buying games to keep his own business afloat, I don't care how people play games. I really don't care. I don't care if they buy a game and never play it, as long as they're buying the game and they're contributing to the industry and spending money into the industry that then trickles down to places like Sifted and everywhere else so that this industry can stay viable. So I never really criticize people for how they play games. They bought it. They can do whatever the heck they want with it. Now, I can understand if you're someone like you who tends to play games differently than that, why it might seem frustrating and you can't understand why somebody else would do things that way. But I'll tell you this, he might be the smart one. Because as we've been talking about a lot over the last few months, like a lot of these big 100-hour, 60-hour, 80-hour games, like you get past the first 30 hours, you're kind of just doing the same thing over and over again. And I get it. People spend $70. They don't want the game to end at 20 or 30 hours, so these publishers pad them out with copy and paste elements. I understand why it's happening. However, like, I don't know. Is he really missing out on a lot? Perhaps you can share with me a game that you've played, or a couple games that you've played over the last couple years, where like the side content was exceptional, where if somebody didn't play the side missions and the side content, they were missing out big time. I can't think of too many. Like, most of these big action RPGs I play, it's like, usually the side quests are just like there. They're not great. In fact, we end up being able to call out the games that do it well because there's so few of them. So, look, I don't want to criticize anyone for how they play games. Once you guys buy a game, do whatever you want with it. Don't play it even. I don't care. Once you've supported the industry by spending that money. And El Timbo also, like, I would not verbalize this stuff to your friend. Like, don't, because it may discourage him from playing and buying games going forward. He may be like, oh, wait, like, am I doing it wrong? Like, am I a pariah? Because how I play? Let him do his thing. Like, don't make fun of him, because what you're going to find is if you do that, one day you're going to call him and he's going to tell you he doesn't play games anymore. So, look, I've always been a live and let live person. Like, I just want people, as long as they're not hurting somebody else, let people do what they want. And this is the same with video games. And again, I think people like that might have the right idea. Look, maybe his job is crazy and he's like, man, I want to get through this game. I only have 10 hours a week now because I have a kid and I have a mortgage and my job is demanding. And he wants to get through the game and see the end. Let him play the games how he wants, El Timbo. All right, our last question for this week's episode of Ask Shane Anything comes from Commander Fett. Why do you think the online discourse around Stellar Blade seems to be so much about people not wanting to admit that they enjoy games with sexy characters? I personally don't find any issues with someone enjoying it for that reason, but a lot of people are trying to say that they're interested in the gameplay and story more than the hyper-sexualized women. I find that hard to believe. Is it because it's a high-profile game and there aren't a lot of other releases to talk about, or do you think it's some other reason? Okay, Commander Fett, there is so much psychology going on with games like Stellar Blade, and I know, and I'll beat that drum again, Helldivers 2. Like, no matter what you tell me, you're never going to convince me that either of those games are top-shelf games. Yet, I would guess Stellar Blade is going to sell like it's a top-shelf game. Helldivers 2 already has. And I don't want to go back to the same thing I've talked about before, but I do believe that there's just been this big drought of first-party PlayStation games, and PlayStation fans are like, hallelujah, here's a couple games that aren't terrible. They're PlayStation fans who want to support the first-party exclusives, and on a certain level, I get it. It's like, hey, if I don't buy this, is PlayStation going to stop making games like this? Meaning, like, not the 8 years in development game, but the 3-year in development game. That's pretty good, and that's pretty much what you're getting with both Stellar Blade and Helldivers 2, like, games that are exclusive that are pretty good. And I think for some people, they're like, I want to support these games because I want more of this. I want those fillers, so to speak, between the God of Wars and The Last of Us and all these big, huge PlayStation exclusives that we are only getting once every like 5 to 7 or 8 years at this point. So I can understand why people want to support the game beyond any of the content in Stellar Blade. I totally get it. Now, back to the other part of it about people saying it's not about the boobs and it's about the gameplay and the story. Well, if you've seen the reviews of Stellar Blade that came out here over the last day or so, pretty much all of them say that the story is the worst part of the game. So I don't know that they have like a leg to stand on there now that we know what the game actually is and we have reviews and people have played the final version and not just the demo. So I don't know if they have a leg to stand on there as far as that's concerned, but I do feel like people feel shame for liking games because of TNA or whatever. Because let's be honest, like our society's kind of moved to this place where we respect women. I know that's a crazy concept. We've kind of got to this place where like objectifying women is kind of frowned upon. And there are some people who still want to objectify women. I mean, that's just really what it comes down to. Or they don't mind if pop culture content objectifies women. And I'm sure they're going to say, oh, it's just a game. It's just a movie. It's just a TV show. They're not real women being objectified. It's an attitude. It's an ideal that people are perpetuating here. So, look, I'm like you. Like I just said in the prior question, like I don't begrudge people who are playing games that they want to or playing games how they want to, as long as they're not hurting other people. Now, people could argue, well, if you support a game like Stellar Blade, then you're kind of second-handedly supporting misogyny and all this other stuff. That's a very tenuous thread, in my opinion, to try to connect those dots. I'm not a psychologist. Probably you aren't either. I don't think we're qualified to come to those conclusions, but I would say this, like, look, if you want to play Stellar Blade because you like the sexy women in the game, then just cop to it. Don't try to come up with some flimsy, goofy excuse, like, because we all knew Stellar Blade was not going to be the next paragon of gameplay advancement, although it's not bad, it's average or whatever. Just be honest. I think that's what most people want from everybody in their life, is just for people to be honest. So I think in general, that's probably what I would say. It's a very complicated situation. Now that the reviews for Stellar Blade are out there and it didn't score especially high, it will be interesting to see if it still sells like through the roof. I personally think it will, but we'll see. I've been wrong before. But again, Stellar Blade, very complicated. I think this is probably the last time we're going to talk about this angle of it, though we're going to talk about it on Game Face here soon, so we'll see. All right, that's it for Ask Shane Anything. Again, kind of apologies for getting this out to you guys on an off day. You're not used to seeing this show on any day but Friday, but with Matt being ill and trying to get everything scheduled, that's just kind of how it worked out. Thanks to all you guys who pledge anything at patreon.com/sifted. I love and appreciate every single one of you folks. And I especially appreciate the people who are pledging at $7 or more per month. And there's a whole gaggle of you guys and girls. And that's why we do this show, because you guys are showing support for the show, which makes me want to do it. I also enjoy doing this show. So anyway, don't really know if I have any messages for you guys about Game Face. We're just kind of in a holding pattern, waiting for Matt to get better. I would like to do a show tomorrow or Friday. But we're kind of getting to the point now where it's kind of absurd to do a show and then do another one in 3 days. But we do have enough content for both. So we'll see how it goes. Keep your fingers crossed. We'll do the best that we can to get Game Face out to you guys as soon as possible. Have yourself a good one, and we'll see you soon.